Hey, it's Dr. Asar, and this lecture is on the economic history and development of China. And this is part one of a series that's focusing on pre-revolutionary China. So if we can divide modern Chinese economic history into four phases, uh, well, we have to understand first that there's the Qing dynasty, okay? This is the period of imperial China that features the Opium Wars and a series of Chinese humiliations during this several hundred-year period. Then we have the era of warlords and civil war and the revolution and so forth, and this takes us up to 1949. Then we have an era of Maoist China, and then we have the reforms of the post-1978 period. So in this slideshow, we're going to talk about the first two of these. Okay, so here's a map which shows the Qing Empire. So this is, imperial China. And the Qing dynasty is a military, economic, and cultural power in Asia up until the 1800s, when there's a series of losses and reversals and humiliations and so forth that threaten and ultimately end the Qing dynasty. So the context here is that there was rising demand in Britain and the rest of Europe for Chinese luxury goods. So for example, things like silk, porcelain, tea, and spices. These are luxury goods. They are things that are not native to Europe, and there's tremendous demand for them. This leads to a large Chinese trade surplus, and these are in silver. Okay, so this is between the 16th and 19th centuries. So China is very wary of its independence, and particularly of the British power, which they understand to be considerable, and they limit trade to just one port city, Canton, now called Guangzhou, for the entire country. So just one port, and look at where it's located, right down here, right? So here's a zoom in of that region. Okay, you can see Hong Kong is here, and so this is inland at the end of this kind of river here. Now let's talk about the role of opium here. Opium is a medicinal and narcotic drug, and its properties have been well known since antiquity. However, what the British do here, they begin to refine opium. It has much stronger narcotic properties. They manufacture it for export in much larger quantities. So you have a product which had been known for a long time, but is at the same time new, much stronger, more addictive, right? More refined. So the area that the British grow poppy in and so on, Bengal, the Ganges River Plain, and they export it in growing quantities to China. So here's just a little graph just showing what's the extent of opium imports into China. And this is kind of a proxy for, well, how widespread is it? What is the consumption of opium that's going on here? And we can see that for a long time here, I mean, from the data that we have in this chart, the total imports to China don't change all that much, right? They're at a low level relative to what we see later, okay? But then about 1800, we see a pretty dramatic picking up, okay? And then as the 1800s continue, I mean, look at this, in just a few decades, going from 1800 to 1839, we see like a 12-fold increase in opium imports, right? Which then increases even further by the late 1880s. So, and this naturally, as you might expect, has a big impact on the society. So the number of opium sellers and opium users increases very rapidly in China, and it leads to all kinds of social problems that we associate with widespread drug use. So it forms a kind of toxic brew with other social ills, poverty, unemployment, and so forth. But what sets off a conflict, an international conflict here, is that China ends up seizing a large shipment of opium and this makes the British become furious at this. They demand the return of this shipment, and they ultimately declare war. And this is known as the First Opium War. Britain at the time has a tremendous naval superiority, so they use that to defeat China, and it leads to the Treaty of Nanjing, which opens more ports and makes Hong Kong a part of the British Empire. The British do not conquer all of China at this point, but they do. They certainly get their way when it comes to openness to trade. That's really the main thing that they wanted here. Um, China is a very sprawling and pretty underdeveloped country in terms of infrastructure. Uh, Difficult, be very difficult for the British to capture and hold. So they content themselves with, getting increasing trade. Now there is continued conflict over this, right? So though they do not control the entire country, though they don't govern the entire country, they do expand into it quite a bit, both economically and culturally, and that leads to further conflicts and ultimately to the Second Opium War, which takes place from 1856 to 1860. And this one includes Britain, France, and the United States. What seems to be going on here is European cultural and economic imperialism, white supremacy, Christian missionary zeal. All these play a role in China's humiliation, which is then followed by the rise of Japanese imperialism, which takes us to the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. This is a struggle for dominance in Korea, and the war really illustrates China's relative failure to modernize, especially, of course, relative to Japan. So the Chinese forces, 630,000 strong, face the Japanese, who have little more than one-third the number of troops. Um, the Japanese kill or wound 35,000 Chinese for only about 5,000 of their own, though another 12,000 or so die of disease, and Japan emerges as the imperial power in Asia, gaining control of Taiwan and Liaodong Peninsula. So really important moment there for Japan, and again, a humiliation for China. I mean, consider the relative sizes of these two nations, right? These relatively small islands of Japan confronting this enormous Chinese empire. But of course, the economic fortunes of these countries are reversed relative to the historical pattern, right? Japan, having industrialized, is in a position to have a much stronger, more advanced, better equipped army than China. All right, so another important event that occurs here is the Boxer Rebellion in 1899 to 1901. And this begins with a nationalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-Christian uprising. Okay, so a response to those forces that I mentioned earlier, right? And this led to a siege on Beijing, and the demand was to eliminate foreigners. Um, and here, a coalition of nations, including the United States, Austro-Hungary, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, all imperialist powers at the time, intervened to break the siege, and it led China to declare war on the foreign invaders. Uh, China was soundly defeated in this conflict and forced to pay huge reparations in silver. These were equal to more than the entire yearly government revenue. So just consider how difficult that's going to be to pay back, right? Just like for yourself, right? A debt that's equivalent to 1 year's income is not going to be paid off anytime soon, right? That's a very significant debt. All right, so the Qing dynasty, due to all these perceived failures, lost popularity and legitimacy. The dynasty was destabilized by the death of the Guangxu emperor in 1908, leading to a successor, Puyi, who was only 2 years old. So you had, therefore, a very weak emperor, who is naturally manipulated by his advisors and so forth. A populist movement begins against the Qing dynasty and in favor of modernization. amidst rising Chinese nationalism, and this led to the Xinhai Revolution of 1911, 1912, and this is led by a nationalist figure named Sun Yatsen. So thus begins the warlord era or civil war era of Chinese history. So here we have, the backdrop for this, what begins this, is the Taiping Rebellion, which goes from 1850 to 1864. And during this rebellion, provincial governors were allowed to form their own armies, as a way of dealing with the uprising. And after that, this is what gives rise to these different power centers that begin to conflict with each other after the Xinhai Revolution. So conflict breaks out between Sun Yat-sen, who died in 1925, and Yuan Shikai, who died in 1916. And it led to a compromise. Okay, so Sun backed Yuan as the president of the Republic of China, but Yuan instead declares himself emperor. But his problem is that many military commanders and governors refused to recognize him as emperor, and said essentially, you're not emperor in my province, in my area that I control. And so fighting broke out and continued until 1928, when the nationalist Kuomintang party under Sun has now died at this point. But his protege, Chiang Kai-shek, unifies the country. Okay, so we have to include in this warlord and civil war period what happens next. Okay, so the Kuomintang party, the KMT here, has unified the country. Okay, like I mentioned, under Chiang Kai-shek, but that's not the end of the conflict, right? Because there is a rising and very popular communist movement. All right, led by this charismatic youngster over here, Mao Zedong. Now, Sun Yat-sen had appealed to the Soviets for help. Okay, so Bolshevik Revolution, of course, has already occurred during this period. Of course, the Bolsheviks have significant problems of their own, but they are committed to communist rebellion succeeding elsewhere. But what's interesting here is that the Soviets did not support Mao, at least exclusively. They had some support, but they also supported Chiang and the KMT. Very, very puzzling, right? Especially since, Chiang is certainly not a Marxist, not a communist, right? The anti-imperialist is really all that they have going for them, from the perspective of the Soviets. But nonetheless, right, both sides get some support, but then Chiang loses a lot of that support because he purges communists from the KMT. And it's a complicated story because then he regains support later during World War II. The Soviets, of course, very much against the Germans and the Japanese, who were, of course, allies with the Nazis. So the Communist Party's Red Army is a small force of about 40,000 troops in 1937, and these are not professional soldiers. This is guerrilla warfare here. In fact, Mao writes a piece on guerrilla warfare, which becomes a very famous piece of writing in terms of the literature on war. And they face an army of 1.7 million, right? So that's huge, very poor odds, right? And this figure includes both the Chinese nationalists and regional warlord forces. So, the nationalists have not managed to disarm the governors. They still have a kind of problem, which is that they are not the only armed power center. However, they are a lot larger than the Red Army, and so the Red Army plays a lengthy game here of attack and retreat. They stay on the move, they hide, they're able to blend in to the peasantry, to the population. And this is a lengthy, bloody conflict which goes on for nearly 2 decades. It's quite remarkable. Um, about 7 million people are killed, including civilians, during the first phase of the conflict. Another maybe 2.5 million or so during the second phase. So, uh, a very bloody conflict. Mao calls this period the Long March. Now, this leads into the Second Sino-Japanese War, which is associated with World War II, 1937 to 1945. It's one of the considered one of the fronts on which World War II is contested. Uh, so the two sides, kind of grudgingly, especially Chiang, grudgingly agreed to suspend the Civil War to fight against the invasion of the Japanese. That's seen as more important. So here's the pattern of the Japanese invasion, right? Um, so they sweep across this region here, right? Um, and so this orangish color here is the Japanese occupation, and these striped regions are the communist strongholds. All right. So they have very different fighting styles here when it comes to resisting the Japanese. So the Red Army, the CPC, they fought using the guerrilla warfare that they had used for years before that. Um, Whereas the KMT fought in more the traditional manner of large armies with fronts and so forth, and they had far more casualties. Um, Now, the Red Army also gained popularity and support during this period, and by the end, many people joined. And this was partly because of the way that they conducted this, right? What gave them the support of the peasantry is they had a very strict code when it came to how do they treat the peasants, right? I mean, armies typically go through the countryside and do a fair amount of burning and looting, right? A fair amount of rape and so forth, right? So Mao made an enormous effort to keep that to an absolute minimum, right? To knowing that if that happened, if he was not able to control those impulses, which all armies have, right? Armies need resources, uh, and they're composed typically of people who don't have a whole lot of wealth, right? So Mao was successful at reining in those impulses and gained a lot of the support of the peasantry during that period. And we can see that as the Red Army grows to 1.3 million, right? So consider this, right? They start at 40,000. And then they have an additional militia of 2.6 million. So the communists are really gaining a lot of popular support during this period. Okay, so now this is a very devastating war for China. It has tremendous loss of life. The military casualties alone are somewhere in the range of 3.2 to 10.8 million. So absolutely a huge death toll there. The Japanese casualties, we don't want to ignore those, right? Somewhere between 3 and 5 million. Tremendous death toll on civilians. So this is one of the things we see in modern warfare. Warfare in the modern era is very difficult on civilians. The kind of reversal of the pattern, warfare historically has killed 90% soldiers, 10% civilians. In the modern era, that reverses itself. Very sad. So this image here shows an atrocity of the war, which is called the Nanjing Massacre, or sometimes called the Rape of Nanking or Nanjing. Um, Somewhere between 50,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilian non-combatants were killed amidst widespread looting and rape by Japanese soldiers. Very sad event here in history. So after World War II ends and the Japanese are defeated, the Civil War actually resumes for 4 years. But the nationalists ultimately flee to Taiwan. They are defeated. We can see here, this is the lines of their retreat here, okay? And then going to Taiwan. So both the Republic of China, this is what the government in Taiwan calls itself, and the People's Republic of China, the PRC, claim to be the only legitimate government of China to this day. So we have an interesting situation, right, where having retreated from the mainland and being forced onto this much smaller island, the the Republic of China says, "Well, we're the true leaders of China," right? That despite what the facts on the ground might look like. So the People's Republic of China, therefore, is created, and Chairman Mao Zedong becomes the leader of China, and is in power from 1949 to 1976. So Mao, more than any other central figure, really shapes the path of China during the second half of the 20th century. So what's going on with the economy during this period? Well, we had decades of war, and along the way we have massive money creation to try and fund all this. Um, so what's the result? Well, by 1946, Chinese manufacturing was operating at only 20% of its capacity and producing only 25% of the pre-war output level. So we can see manufacturing, which was already not very developed, was in a much worse situation after the war. Now, to make matters worse, between 1936 and 1949, the money supply increased by a staggering 120 billion times its previous level. Wow, right? They didn't add 120 billion, right? That's multiplied by 120 billion, right? So that's going to cause hyperinflation, right? When you massively increase the money supply, money is going to go down in value, right? That's well known. We can see the impact of this in terms of China's share of global GDP. Now, this also includes, of course, the growth that other countries experience, but it's a good indicator, right? Because it's showing that China is really being left behind in terms of the global economic growth, which is considerable during this period, right? From 1900 to 1950, this is a period of rapid growth, both in the capitalist world and in the socialist world, which the economies of Russia, Soviet Union, and the Eastern Bloc. So while China's GDP per capita falls during this period, okay, from 12% of Britain's to 7%. So again, there's two forces going on there. One is Britain's growth, and the other is China's relative lagging relative to that growth. All right, so if we look at the class structure of pre-revolutionary China, remember we're using Marxist notion of class here, constructing class as the relation between the producers of surplus and the appropriators of surplus have with others in the economy. So we're staying with a very much Marxist class analysis here. So if we divide the economy into different sectors, so if we start with agriculture, agriculture is the largest sector of the economy. Most people are peasant farmers in China at the time, and agriculture is really dominated by the ancient fundamental class process. Okay, so that is the individuals who produce surplus also appropriate that surplus. Okay, so there's not somebody else that is exploiting them. However, even though this situation doesn't have exploitation, it does have a class of landlords. And these landlords take a large portion of the crops in a kind of a sharecropping system. Okay, so in some cases, rent is paid in money. In many cases, it's paid in terms of a portion of the crops themselves. So that's something we need to kind of analyze and understand a little bit more. In terms of industry or manufacturing, there is a small emerging capitalist fundamental class process taking place in manufacturing, that is, with employees and employers and the wage-labor relationship that we're familiar with in other forms of capitalism. But this is not dominant. This is very small. It's very underdeveloped. Okay. Now, in terms of households, if we look at what is the relation between the producer and the appropriator of surplus, this can be described as a feudal fundamental class process but on a small scale. So my source for this is this wonderful book here by Satyananda Gabriel called Chinese Capitalism and the Modernist Vision. All right, so if we look at land ownership in China, what we find here is that land ownership is pretty unequal. You have 10% of families owning a little over 2/3 of the land. But the landlords own much smaller portions of land than did the feudal aristocracy in Europe or Tsarist Russia. Only about 45 acres on average, and there's far more landlords as well. So that's a difference between the legacy of European feudalism that the Soviets confront versus the situation in China. So the landlords, of course, extract rent from their tenants, again, often in the form of crops. And on average, this ends up being about 50 to 70% of the total crop. So again, even though these ancient farmers, but again, that's the term that we're using to represent that they are independent commodity producers, there's no corvée, there's no wage that they're receiving, right? They produce goods, they produce crops, and if they own the land, their own land, then they don't have to pay rent, of course. But many of them are tenant farmers, where they do have to pay rent. Sometimes they borrow money, very often from those same landlords, and so the landlords are often in a position to get not only rent, but also interest on these loans. So these are non-class revenues, but they're very unfair nonetheless, right? Even though this is not formally exploitation by the Marxist definition, it's very problematic, right? There's a parasitic landlord class which extracts value by virtue of just owning land or because of loans and so on. Okay, so again, it's not feudalism. Okay, there's no corvée. The peasants appropriate the surplus that they individually produce. It is the ancient fundamental class process or independent commodity production. So this chart shows the distribution of land in China in the 1930s, and we can see we had here landlords. It's 2.4 million people. That's 4% of the total population. Their land ownership is 108 million acres. So that's about 50% of the land. So remarkable, right? That's pretty uneven ownership. Now you also had these well-to-do farmers. So they're often called by the Russian phrase kulak. That's not a term that's used in China, but of course it's influential among Marxists because of all of the reforms of really revolution, actually would be a better term for that, because the revolutions that the Bolsheviks complete in agriculture, often at the expense of these well-to-do or wealthy farmers. There's about 3.6 million of these, or 6% of the total, and they own 38.9 million. This is where I got this figure, right? 68% of the total land is owned by just 10% of the total population. Now then there are peasants who are sort of in the middle. Okay, there's 12 million of these, and they own about 15% of the land, despite being at 20% or so of the population. So they own far less land, right? Despite being twice as many people, they own far less land. Okay, and then we have our poor peasants and farm laborers who often own nothing whatsoever, right? So farm laborers means, you're kind of at the very lowest. You're not even a tenant, but you work for others, right? So there's a lot of these families, right? 42 million, 70% of the total, and they own very little, right? They do own some land, but it's by far a minority share. So the economy that the PRC inherits is largely agricultural and has been devastated by decades of warfare. and it's never really had a unified economic policy in the modern era. So, that's an opportunity to change the way that the economy functions. Uh, but it's also a daunting reality, right? That the People's Republic of China here is starting with, again, a very agriculturally dominated and fairly backward economy. Most people are peasants. Uh, Manufacturing is very, very poorly developed, and so this is their situation. Like the Soviets, they take it as one of their prime missions to rapidly industrialize, which we'll examine in the next lecture, which looks at Maoist China. So that's it for this one. Thank you very much.